Since around 2016, the term fake news has become quite prominent in our thinking about the media and our thinking about why people's beliefs about events in the world sometimes go wrong. Now, studying fake news is clearly something that could be done by a sociologist or a political scientist or people from different parts of the sciences, but it's also something that we can study in epistemology, because clearly fake news has something to do with how we arrive at beliefs, how justification works, and how all of that is going to look in reality, in our actual social situation. So what I want to do in this video is, first, I want to talk about what fake news is, right? How can we define it or think about it? And then I'm going to talk about what the dangers of fake news are, from the perspective of an epistemologist especially, right? What kind of troublesome epistemological consequences, right? Consequences for knowledge or belief or things like that are there when we have an environment with a lot of fake news. And then finally, I will say a little bit about different ways that people have been thinking about combating fake news and how they interact maybe with the different dangers that we have seen in the second part of the video. So let's start with that first part, trying to define fake news. Now, in order to be fake news, clearly, whatever it is, has to look like news, right? It has to look like a piece of news. So if I write down a completely false sentence like, Socrates was the teacher of Aristotle. Right, that's false. Socrates was not the teacher of Aristotle, he was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. So Socrates was the teacher of Aristotle. Well, that's false, but it's clearly not fake news, because it doesn't look like news. I mean, Socrates and Aristotle have been dead for, well, a lot longer than 2,000 years actually, so there's nothing newsworthy about this. So, any definition of fake news will kind of have to start either with a definition of news or just with assuming that we already know what news is, right? And I don't know whether we have a really good definition of news. It probably has something to do with, it's a report about something that's supposed to have happened recently, which has a certain kind of significance, fairly often a kind of political or social or economic significance, something like that. That's not a perfect definition of news, but it gives us a broad idea of what we're talking about. So, we can start with that. Fake news looks like news. Okay, but it's fake, right? There's something wrong with it. Well, what is wrong with it? Well, the first thing we could try is maybe fake news is false, right? That's what's going on. Somebody's giving a report, it looks like news, but it's false. Now, unfortunately, falsehood is neither necessary nor sufficient for something being fake news. Okay, so let's start with why it's not sufficient. Why something can be false and look like news and yet not be fake news. Well, here's one way in which something can be false and look like news. It's because a completely bona fide journalist made a mistake, right? They researched something, but they made a mistake. Maybe they did everything correctly, but still something went wrong. They arrived at a false belief. That's what they write up in their news report. And so we get a news report which is like, it's made in good faith. It actually sort of, all the journalistic standards have been followed, but it's false. Okay, that's unfortunate, but it's not what we talk about when we talk about fake news. Right? It's not fake. It's wrong. I mean, something went wrong, but it's not fakeness that went wrong. Okay, so falsity seems to be, that can't be enough, right? It's not sufficient. In order to be fake, more needs to be wrong than just falsehood. But falsehood is also not necessary, right? It doesn't have to be false in order to be fake news. So, for instance, there was a famous fake news story by a famous fake news website. And basically the claim of the article was this: large crowd of Muslims sets fire to a church. Okay, large crowd of Muslims sets fire to a church. Wow, okay, that sounds pretty heavy. Well, what really happened was that well, there were New Year's celebrations, and among the New Year's celebrators were, yeah, that's right, some Muslim community who set off some fireworks, which was completely legal, and one piece of firework got caught in some netting around a local church. There was a tiny fire, the fire department came and put it all out, and that's the end of the story, right? It was not intentional, the church wasn't even damaged. There was nothing going on of the kind that the headline suggested. I mean, the headline was true, right? Large crowd of Muslims sets fire to a church. That kind of happened, but it absolutely didn't happen in the way that the headline suggests. So that would be a piece of news that's not so much false as misleading, right? In this case, I suppose, intentionally misleading. So maybe in order to be fake news, it doesn't have to be false, it could also be misleading. Or maybe that's not even necessary. There are also examples of people who created news websites which they just filled with sort of random stories. And I suppose nowadays you could have those random stories written by artificial intelligence. And those stories might be false, or they might be true, and these people didn't care. I mean, they were just there for the clicks. They were just there to get money from advertisements. They didn't care whether it was true or false. And so some of that stuff might have been accidentally true, and some of it might have been false, also kind of accidentally. Truth just didn't play a role in the creation of these stories. And that would seem to be enough, actually, to qualify it as fake news. Right? So maybe we could say something like, well, fake news has to be false or misleading. But maybe we want to go even a little bit further on, and we want to say, well, something is fake news if the author didn't care about the literal truth, or didn't take care to make sure it was literally true, or wasn't interested in conveying sort of the truth that, is the content of the news article, or something like that. Right? So it can be quite a bit weaker than falsehood. Something could be true and still count as fake news, maybe. I mean, it's not a crazy thought, at the very least. A website that just puts on supposed news articles which might happen to be true or false, yeah, we can call that a fake news website, even if not all of it is false. So, fake news, it looks like news, and it has this element of fakehood, which consists in not aiming at the truth, or not caring about the truth, or even actively trying to mislead or lie. Right? That's why it really doesn't count as news. Well, is that enough for a definition of fake news? Well, maybe it is, but it defines fake news in a very isolated way. Right? I mean, this little item is fake news. And I think it makes some sense to say that fake news is a bigger phenomenon than that. Right? Something can only be fake news in a certain kind of environment. An environment where this type of news that doesn't rise to the standards of truth, where it is endemic, or where it is systematic, right? Where it happens a lot, or where the ways in which it is set up, the ways in which information is shared among people, for instance, is such that this kind of information also gets shared a lot and manages to take up a relatively large amount of space in this sort of news landscape. Right? If that doesn't happen, then I don't think we will be talking about fake news maybe in those terms. Right? When we talk about fake news, we don't seem to be just talking about the individual articles, for instance. We seem to be talking about something like a social or societal phenomenon, which is big, right? Which requires a lot of stuff going on, not just these articles, but also their spreading and the systems that make this spreading not only possible, but in fact likely and actual. So maybe we want to add something to our definition of fake news and say something like, well, and it's a systematic phenomenon in society. Or maybe what I'm also tempted to do is to say that, we only really talk about fake news when we think of it as something that exists next to, and maybe it's even in competition with real news, right? So, for instance, if you're living in a totalitarian state, where all information is controlled by the state and you just, generate stories that fit their preferred narrative all the time, and those are the only stories that you can get. I don't think we'd call that fake news, right? I mean, I think we would call that state propaganda or something like that. And of course, it's a well-known historical phenomenon. And if fake news is supposed to be something relatively new, then it can't be that, right? And so maybe what's different about fake news is that it operates in an environment where supposedly there's also good news going on, there's real journalism going on, but the real journalism is seen as competing with these fake news stories. Okay, so 3 elements to the story I've been trying to tell about what fake news is. Right, it looks like news, it somehow falls short of the standards of truth, could be by being false, but maybe it's more something like it's intentionally misleading, or it's just not even aimed at the truth, right? Something like that would be the second ingredient. And then maybe, but this is a little bit more controversial, maybe we also need to say something about the system of which it's a part, right? Maybe we should say something like, well, it's part of a system where it spreads easily, and maybe we should say something like it's part of a system where it is competing with real news, right? Real good journalism, a free press, and so on. Okay, so let's take that as our idea of what fake news is and move on to the second part of the video. And in the second part of the video, I want to ask, well, what's so bad about fake news, right? What are the epistemic dangers? And we could also talk about other dangers, right? I mean, we could also talk about political dangers, for instance. And it makes sense to ask ourselves something like, is fake news does it endanger democracy, for instance? That's a good question. It's not a question I'm going to ask in this video, because in this video we are going to be focusing on epistemic dangers. Okay, so here's the first and most easily seen epistemic danger. It is that fake news is going to make people believe false things, right? If you see some fake news and you believe it, and it turns out to be false or misleading, which fake news often is, then you end up believing something that's false, or you end up believing something that's misleading, which, actually might entail believing some falsehoods, right? If I read that news report about a large crowd of Muslims sets fire to a church, I believe that. Well, I probably also believe that they did it intentionally, it was a big fire, this is an act of religious hatred. All of that I probably believe, and so I get to believe all these falsehoods, right? These things that are not true. And so this is clearly the case, right? This is clearly one of the dangers of fake news, right? If things that look like news stories are being transmitted, maybe across social media or in some other way, and people believe them, that they end up believing false things. And of course, that is epistemically bad. And fairly often, the false things that they will end up believing might also have big social or political implications, right? I mean, they might lead people into action, political action, or other types of action that are actively harmful because they're based on a wrong view of what is going on. So, there's a very clear epistemic danger there. But from an epistemological point of view, things are a little bit more interesting or complicated or dangerous than that. Because you might be a victim of fake news, one could say, even if you don't believe it. So even if you don't end up believing the fake news, so you don't end up with these false beliefs, fake news might still be epistemically harming you. Okay, so how could it do that? Well, one way to think about this is to think that fake news is in a sense degrading our epistemic environment. Okay, what do I mean with that? Well, suppose that this happens, right? I used to live in a place where people love speaking the truth to me, right? So I talk to people, they speak the truth to me, I believe them. Great, I come to believe a lot of true things. But now I move to some other place. And in that other place, some people like to speak the truth, but there are also a lot of people who they go into these really elaborate jokes where they make claims with a straight face and they keep repeating them, and they even sort of help each other. Like somebody is telling one of these, trying to make me believe something false, and this other friend hears them do it and they join in. And like only weeks or months later, they will come back to me and say, I got you, that's not true. I mean, suppose that happens a lot right around me. Well, what's that going to do to me? Well, maybe I'll end up believing false things, right, if I believe these people. But maybe I catch on, right? And maybe I catch on and maybe I just stop believing people when they tell me things, right? And if I stop believing people when they tell me things, then of course I won't be caught believing these false things, right? I mean, they can't make me believe these false things because I no longer trust their testimony. But that's actually bad. Even if I don't end up with false beliefs, it's bad because if I stop trusting people's testimony, I'm also going to stop trusting the testimony of people who actually tell me the truth, right? So I am deprived of a way of finding out about the truth, namely the trustworthy testimony of other people. And so even if I don't end up believing false things, I might still be epistemically harmed because it's harder for me to believe true things. Well, it makes a lot of sense to believe that this is going on when we think about an environment with a lot of fake news. Right? Suppose I go onto social media and suppose that I have caught on to the fact that there's a lot of fake news on social media. Right? What people have been telling me is, well, don't believe anything that you read on Twitter, see on TikTok, hear on Facebook, whatever. Right? Whatever social medium I'm on. People tell me don't believe it. And I think, yeah, they're right. I mean, there's so much fake news, don't believe it. Now, a lot of the stuff that people are telling me there is probably true, right? I mean, most of the people are telling me true things. Most of the stories that I read are true, but I don't believe them, right? I'm careful. I only believe them after I've done maybe some research or whatever, but I don't just believe them. So I've stopped trusting testimony, at least in that environment. At least unless I know the people very, very well or something like that. Well, that actively harms me, right? I am now less able to learn from people. And this might happen to like individual people that I know on social media. It might also happen with me with respect to other news sources, right? I mean, suppose that I've read some of these news stories, I believe them, they turned out to be fake. I think you can't believe news stories. And now I also don't trust trustworthy journalists anymore. Right? I mean, if that happens to me again, I have been epistemically harmed. Even though I don't end up with any false beliefs, I do end up with fewer true beliefs. It's harder for me to get knowledge about the world. And so that's a way in which fake news might degrade my epistemic environment to the point where I just don't trust things as much as I used to. And it's rational not to trust things as much as I used to. But it also deprives me of knowledge, right? So that's bad. Now, I think that's a very important insight, right? Even if you don't end up believing the fake news, you can be epistemically harmed. And now I'd like to go a little bit further with that thought. And I'd like to make the following claim, which, as far as I know, is not really a term that is used in the philosophy of fake news so far, but it popped into my head and I kind of liked it. I thought maybe we can think of fake news as a kind of epistemic parasite, right? It's a sort of parasite. It's almost a sort of disease that sort of manages to get into me, like epistemically speaking, and then I have to deal with it. And dealing with it is, in many senses, something that's harmful. Even if I deal with it successfully, it's still harmful that I had to deal with it. In the same sense that if you get some kind of virus or real parasite, okay, maybe your body is going to end up defeating it, but you spend a lot of time and energy doing that, and maybe you are sick in bed or whatever. Okay, we're not literally sick in bed, but maybe something, of this type of harm is going on in an environment with a lot of fake news. Well, what am I thinking of? Well, suppose that somebody does this, right? And again, I'll take a real fake news story as my example. Suppose that somebody reads some emails of Hillary Clinton in which she orders a cheese pizza. And this person thinks, cheese pizza? Well, it starts with the same letters as child pornography. Let's write a story about how Hillary Clinton runs a pedophile network from a pizza tent. This really happened, right? And so they do that. right? And so they send out this story, and it becomes popular, and some people start spreading it maybe because they believe it. Some people start spreading it because they like to politically harm Hillary Clinton. But then also, of course, people start reporting it and thereby spreading it, reporting on it and thereby spreading it, because it's something that people are talking about, right? And so it becomes newsworthy, right? The fake news itself becomes newsworthy. And so maybe that's how I learn about it, right? I read an article which says, oh, there are these crazy conspiracy theories, and this is their crazy conspiracy theory, right? So it's not even presented to me as true. It's presented to me as false, but I still read it. And then I have to think about it a little bit, right? And I think, well, no, that's completely unbelievable because of this and this and this reason. And maybe I was like, how could anybody believe this, right? And I spent some time finding out. I mean, what were their arguments? Are they really as rubbish as they sound? Yeah, okay, they were as rubbish as they sounded. Okay, and so here I am, and I've spent, who knows, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 15 minutes? I mean, I've spent a portion of my time thinking about this insane claim and debunking it, and thinking about why people believed it, and thinking about the argumentation. And so I've been doing this epistemic work for something that really wasn't worth it, right? It really wasn't worth thinking about. Well, and it's not just me who has been doing that, right? Maybe 10 million people have been doing that, right? And so some random person somewhere spent 30 minutes writing up a crazy conspiracy theory, and then 10 million people spend maybe an average of 10 minutes thinking about it. That's 100 million thinking minutes wasted right down the drain. I mean, we could have been thinking about something real, about something important. I mean, think of all the stuff I could be doing. So, especially in an environment with a lot of fake news, right, where you hear these weird stories and conspiracy theories and this and that like every day, you're going to end up spending a significant amount of time thinking about stuff that isn't worth thinking about. And it's really hard to stop doing it, right? I mean, if you hear about it, you're immediately like, oh my God, no. I mean, it's hard to stop thinking about it. It gets into your mind like a kind of epistemic parasite. And even if you reach the rational conclusion that you shouldn't believe it, even if you never even were tempted to believe it, it's still there and you're still dealing with it. So that's one thing. So you invest time, which is basically wasted. You might also invest emotions, right? I mean, a lot of these stories are meant to outrage. Like you're like, oh no, I mean, how could people believe that? And you might even get sort of epistemically outraged. Like, why are people so irrational? But of course, I mean, these stories are often meant to push all kinds of buttons. Like they're supposed to get you enraged or angry or fearful or whatever. I mean, they're going to make your life like emotionally worse. And you have to spend some emotional energy on overcoming that. And it might be pretty low level, right? But if it happens a lot, it's going to make your life worse. And anybody who's ever been in a kind of social media community where there's a lot of fake news, I mean, maybe not being propagated so much as being commented upon, like, oh no, look what these crazies have come up with this time. You might know the sort of draining effect that this has on you, right? It really doesn't help raising your level of trust in humanity, your level of hope, your level of optimism, you know, the kind of stuff that we need. So, in that sense also, it's a kind of epistemic parasite. You have to spend time on it, but also emotional energy. It's wasting your time, it's wasting your energy. And here's an interesting psychological effect. It's fairly well known from psychological studies that even if you don't believe it, even if you have a lot of evidence that debunks these claims, they're still going to have an impact on you, right? They're still going to sort of linger. There might be some kind of lingering uncertainty, which definitely doesn't come to the level of, oh, maybe it's true, but it's still kind of there, right? It's still that when you hear a story about Muslims, you think, oh, you mean the people, oh no, they actually didn't set fire to the church. It's still the kind of situation where you hear the name Hillary Clinton and it's associated in your mind with child pornography, even if you know that the association is fake, right? And those associations and those sort of lingering elements of uncertainty, they're there, right? They're psychologically real, and it's really hard to get rid of them, right? Maybe it's almost impossible to get rid of them. And so even if you don't believe the fake news, even if you make the rational decision, there's still a psychological effect. And so even if you sort of debunk fake news, for instance, you're actually helping that kind of epistemic harm spread. Okay, so that was the second part of my story. What's the harm in fake news? Well, first of all, people might end up believing false things. But second of all, it might erode your trust in testimony. And third of all, fake news can act in different ways as a kind of epistemic parasite that wastes your time and energy and actually sort of degrades your psychological situation. So, third part of the video. What can we do against fake news? Well, not easy to give a simple answer to that, of course. But people have been thinking about different strategies. And I think the most I can do here is I'll give a brief overview of a few strategies, a few ways of thinking that people have had and how they might help. So one important distinction is between like systematic strategies and individualist strategies, where a systematic strategy tries to change something about the environment in which we, like the ways maybe in which information gets spread. And those individualist remedies are more about, okay, how can we help people, like individual people, deal with fake news better? So if you think about systematic solutions, like one thing you might be thinking about is, okay, a lot of fake news gets spread through social media, so we should change the way that information gets spread on social media, right? Maybe social media platforms should flag dubious news stories, right? This might be wrong. That's possible. But that might not help so much, right? I mean, if you think about the degradation of our epistemic environment, and if you think about this epistemic parasite element, then just labeling something as this might be wrong, it doesn't really help with that, because I'm still seeing it, I'm still reading it. So maybe instead these social media platforms should change their algorithms, right? I mean, it's well known that a lot of algorithms of like the biggest commercial social media platforms, what they tend to do is they tend to show you content that you will probably react to. Well, what do you react to? Well, you probably react to things that outrage you, right? Where you think, no, how can somebody believe that? How can they be so stupid? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people react to emotionally, that they engage with by typing something, some reply. So that's actually stuff that gets promoted by social media algorithms to a fairly large extent. And so one of the things that you could try to do is to tell social media companies to stop doing that, right? To make their algorithms de-emphasize that kind of content. But that's not so easy. I mean, those companies are in different countries and operating in different countries. Those algorithms, they're hard to test, they're hard to check. It's not maybe also so easy to say what fake news is or what types of stories should be downgraded. It's okay, maybe it will help, right? It will help with the spread, and if it helps with the spread, then it helps with the epistemic parasite element, and so it might be worth trying. It's also clear that it might not be easy. Well, that's not a reason not to try something, of course, but it's good to keep in mind. So that's the type of systemic solution that people have been thinking about, right? Changing social media algorithms or putting like warning flags on things, stuff like that. When we think about more individualist strategies, one thing we could try to do is to improve people's critical thinking, right? If you teach people, maybe already at school, to make a distinction between what is true and what is false, like you give them news articles and you ask them, well, how do you know whether this is believable? Maybe that will help them seeing through fake news, right? This is a possibility. One good thing about it, I suppose, is that it's, you're teaching them epistemic virtues, which are good anyway, I mean, who could be against this, right? Who could be against teaching people to make up their minds in a more rational way? I mean, that sounds perfect. So there's definitely something to be said for it. It's not clear how much it is actually going to help, I suppose. Because when you ask people to engage critically with fake news, well, you might be taking something away from the danger of believing the falsehoods, but you are actually increasing the dangers that I talked about later, right? The danger of noticing that you're in this epistemically degraded community where you can't trust people anymore. Or this problem of the epistemic parasite, right? If I'm critically thinking about fake news, I've already caught the bug, right? I mean, the fake news story is in my head precisely where I don't want it. So I love critical thinking, but it's unclear whether it's like the perfect tool against fake news. So here's another thing that people have been saying. They've been saying, well, in order to combat fake news, what you have to do is you have to push people to get their news from varied sources, right? Make sure that you don't only watch this one television program or don't just get it from your news from social media, but, get it from a wide variety of sources. And again, I mean, that's sort of epistemically virtuous, to a certain extent at least. To a certain extent, that's epistemically virtuous, right? I mean, you want people to be able to not get stuck, maybe with a news medium that doesn't give them very good information. So you want them to be able to check out different media and see what's happening. It's also a lot to ask. I mean, if I read a newspaper every day, I'm already doing a lot to inform myself about the world, right? Asking me to read different newspapers, it's, you're asking quite a bit of people. And again, this might help against the problem of people believing fake news, but it doesn't really seem to help with the problems of the degradation of the epistemic environment or the problem of the epistemic parasite. So really, the only way to combat those last two problems consist in just reducing the amount of fake news in the environment, for which something like intervening on social media algorithms, well, that might be a way to do it. There might be other ways to do it. I'm not sure what they would be, but it's certainly worth thinking about. Okay, so those are some of the ways that you can think about fake news from the perspective of epistemology. I think it's an extremely practical topic. So it shows us how close epistemology can be to sort of real problems in real life. And I think it also shows that by thinking about something like, well, what is the epistemic problem? Oh, it's not just believing falsehoods, right? It's also the degradation of trust in testimony. It's also this idea of the epistemic parasite, and maybe other things as well. I mean, that's the type of thing that epistemologists are good at, right? At going beyond sort of the obvious, like, oh, it's false, thinking about like the epistemic situation in more detailed terms, and it really helps evaluating the kind of solutions that we would need to get to a better situation. So I do think that this is a topic where epistemology shows itself to be useful.